Okay, so I've got that it's 2 o'clock, so we can go ahead and get started. So on behalf of Amarutha and Sean and myself, I'd like to welcome you to our session called Making a Good First Impression, Metadata Quality Metrics for Earth Observation Data and Information. In many ways, if you were in the 11 o'clock session, you could think of this as a part 2 to that session. So Ted and Matt were talking a lot about fair metadata and evaluating that and what does that mean. So in this session, we're really exploring information quality dimensions, which, and Ted touched on one aspect of that, can be any number of things, including accuracy, completeness, timeliness, accessibility, provenance, and many more. So we can use these dimensions to potentially generate metrics to evaluate how well metadata is doing. So organizations typically prioritize which of these dimensions is important to them, and we kind of hinted at that earlier this morning in Ted's session. And you'll see that in the first 3 talks given today, where we're looking at these different dimensions and what's important to these priorities. One other thing that happened as we were putting together this session is that a lot of conversation is starting to develop around some new requirements that are coming from the federal government for federal agencies. There are several things that were passed by the government, including the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, and a corresponding OMB guidance is coming out for that. And so we also started thinking about, what do these new guidelines, how do they relate to the things that we're doing, and how should we be thinking about that? I know that it doesn't apply to necessarily everyone, but it is something that will be shaping how we think about our requirements in metadata and quality. So our first speaker is Janae. She'll be talking about metadata scoring through the lens of the Common Framework for Earth Observation Data.
And then there was someone that said in German, that puts in the chat in German. Is there? I think. Was this someone that was presenting? Or? Okay.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janae LaRue, and as Kaylin mentioned, looking at metadata scoring through the lens of this common framework document that I'll talk some more about. So I'm coming from the NASA Earth Science perspective. In particular, I work for a group called Impact, and we help to support some goals of the NASA's Earth Science Data Systems program. So just a quick background there. Oops. Okay. Sorry about that. So in particular, within Impact, one of the projects I work on is this analysis and review of CMR, or ARC project for short, sorry, a little nickname. And so what we do is we assess NASA's metadata records in the Common Metadata Repository. So the Common Metadata Repository is a centralized database that houses all of NASA's Earth Science metadata records describing all of the data sets that are archived across 12 different archive centers. And so as part of this process, we assess these records by both a automated and manual process. So we'll bring in a record, do some initial automated checks, but then there is a fairly detailed manual review component that goes on after that. We do just report on what we find to the data providers or the data centers, since they are ultimately the stewards of this metadata. And so, how do we approach this? We have a quality framework that we follow. So when we do these checks, we have these criteria. So like say we run into X issue, we'll give Y recommendation and put it into a color category. So we have red, yellow, blue. Red just being, trying to communicate to the data center, hey, this is something you might want to fix sooner rather than later. Yellow being sort of like highly recommended, but maybe not required things to implement. And then just more minor inconsistency errors will flag as blue. So this is kind of our way to track baseline metrics throughout this process. And then the idea is, once updates are made, the number of flagged issues would go down. Yeah, so if you want more details, there's a link in the slides, and I'll make sure to upload these to Figshare. So getting into the scoring aspect, there's no formal metadata scoring currently being implemented in the CMR. And so this is just purely hypothetical, exploring some possibilities coming from our perspective, from the assessments that we have done. So yeah, so like I said, we've looked at quite extensively records from all of these different NASA data centers. And so taking that perspective, potential approach one is, we can take our existing kind of framework and number of red, yellow, blue, and somehow turn this into a score. But as I mentioned, this is very much a baseline metric. There's some level of maybe inconsistency looking at these numbers from DAC to DAC. These are also highly dependent on manual review. So, we'd have to find a way to automate this in some fashion. So it would be a much more lightweight version of what we do. And it also just focuses on, we find an error and we make a recommendation, but there's no additional sort of credit given to things beyond that aspect. So potential approach two, and something that I'm going to talk mainly about today, is doing a metadata score inspired by the Common Framework for Earth Observation Data. So there's a link to it here. I'm not going to click on it. This is a Obama era framework that was written. It's specifically for Earth observation data. It was also written by members of this community. And so we felt that it could be a potential approach or perspective to take for metadata scoring. This is something we had initially thought about a couple of years ago. It didn't really go anywhere, just kind of let's try it out. It didn't, like I said, didn't go anywhere. So I kind of decided to dust it off for this session since it's relevant. So the idea would be, we have the common framework suggestions and guidelines and recommendations. They are curated around discoverability, accessibility, and usability, and we can take those principles and apply them to metadata. So the common framework has these four categories. And so in creating this potential scoring mechanism, we just map those directly into three categories. So discoverability, accessibility, and usability. So very similar to the talk earlier on the FAIR suite checks, you would identify fields, metadata elements that correspond to these different categories, and then have a corresponding check. If it passes, you get a point. If it doesn't, you don't. So I guess the more points you have, the better. So going into a little bit more detail, so data discovery, there are specific recommendations in the common framework around identifiers. We know those are important, how to cite data, so on and so forth. So some sample checks we could have is, is licensing information being provided? Is this something that could be easily automated? It's one of those, is it there, is it not? Is there a DOI? Things like science keywords and abstracts, are they there? There are certain, automation that you can do for that, but then getting into the more detailed things would need to be probably manual, are these science keywords accurate is something that may or may not be able to deduce in an automated fashion. So data accessibility, just some notes coming from the common framework document. Says data will be accessible online. It also emphasizes services. So some sample checks we could have for a score is, is there a direct data access point? Is it healthy? And then you could get additional points for providing a subsetting or visualization service such as OpenDAP. And with the way the CMR metadata is set up, we could do this in an automated fashion. So then going into usability, kind of copy and pasted a lot of relevant text there. But one of the things it covers is data formats. So going into the interoperability aspect, there are actually specific formats for Earth observation data promoted in the document. So something we can do is, if data format is provided in the metadata, that's number one, that's really good. And that's something that is becoming increasingly important to be documented in the metadata itself. And then does it fall into that interoperable format category? So it's not some proprietary format, but is it, something that people want to use, like NetCDF, GeoTIFFs, etc. And then furthermore, spatial and temporal extent. If it's there, you can validate that in automated fashion, but is it correct? Might require a bit more of a manual approach, potentially. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. Like I said, it's been a couple of years since we've looked at this, and so I think it might be interesting to pick this back up in the coming year. It would just be a prototype, try it. It wouldn't be public or anything like that, and just see what happens. Of course, down the road, an actual implementation would be very much a community effort, community buy-in and involvement, etc. And then there is, of course, existing efforts that we can look at as well. Of course, if you can automate the whole thing, that's the easiest, most lightweight approach. But maybe there could be kind of like an add-on or a bonus where certain manual criteria could be met. Who knows? So that's it. I'll leave you to think about that. And I don't know if I'll take some questions now, but we can also tie it into our discussion at the end.
How much did you draw from the FAIR questions to establish this? Or did you draw in at all?
So this was really directly inspired by the Common Framework document itself. And so that document does touch on a lot of sort of the FAIR principles, but it doesn't directly address it as FAIR. But a lot of the same concepts are in there.
Hi. Gee, I forgot what I was going to ask you. Yeah, I did.
All right, well, that makes it easy for me. So.
Do you plan on updating your questions based on what they were talking about with the FAIR principles discussed earlier?
We definitely need to take that into consideration. Like I said, step one will just be going through, the work we had done previously, seeing is it things that need to be updated, or is there some additional things we can take into consideration? So, sure.
So this is just an idea. It hasn't actually been implemented. Is that correct?
Yes, it's an idea. Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of a different twist on the kind of what we talked about earlier. Okay.
So is the idea this would be integrated into CMR or sort of a standalone separate thing? And does it operate on metadata?
Yeah, so our initial thought for this is we have, for our assessments that we do, we have a tool that we use. It's kind of separate. It's not directly connected to the CMR in any way. So what we were initially thinking was maybe we could integrate some sort of like baseline score into this tool. So as we do our assessments, there will be kind of this metric that it will, or score that it will throw on, and then we'll have those recommendations on top of that. But it never went through. We just kind of ran out of time and effort. And so maybe way down the road, long term, with all kinds of approval and involvement, it could get integrated into the CMR. But that's, I guess, one of the big questions of the session is: should we even do that? Should we not do that? How do we do that?
So maybe the other question or another approach would be some mechanisms for feedback, so that directly back to the producer of the metadata.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm falling down on my job as session host, and I forgot to mention earlier that we are going to have a discussion period after the presentations to talk about some of the questions that were listed in the session description. So our next speaker is Amrutha from USGCRP, and she will be talking about the Global Change Information System Provenance Evaluator.
Do you have it on like a flash drive or anything? Or was it downloaded from something? Was it like sent via email? Like we could re-download it? Or oh, she has paid. Do you have another? I think it just must have like not like been corrupted when they downloaded it or something. Yeah, copy over there. Do you want to log into your Google Drive and then try to download it? Yeah. Okay. So she'll share her screen.
For the people online, we're having some technical difficulties here. So Ping, would you be prepared to present your work next?
Sure.
Okay, great. So Ping will be,
Do you want share the screen?
yeah,
Yes, I got it.
okay. And I'll try to get the file on her drive.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. How does my sound?
You sound great.
The volume is okay, or I need to be a little louder?
No, I think you sound great.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start. Hello, everybody. My name's Payne, and I'm a research scholar at the Corporate Institute between NOAA and the North Carolina State University. Appreciate the opportunity to present to you NOAA's data stewardship maturity metrics that can be used to provide stewardship maturity scores and the quality information. A little bit background and history as previous session and some other sessions, you notice that the quality tend to focus on the quality of metadata tend to focus on the completeness of the metadata records. Part of the reason because the quality, and also I'd like to add even the FAIR principle kind of shine away from the quality itself. Part of the reason being that the it is very hard to assess or provide assessment of the data quality. And the data quality is multidimensional, as well as the fact that there's no standard way to do so. I will not touch on that part, but focus on the why we decide to develop the data stewardship maturity metrics and some application, especially the OneStop project. So as many of you probably know, the NCEI National Centers for Environmental Information is known as official archive for environmental data and authoritative source for environmental information. National Climate Data Center, now a part of NCEI, was known as official archive for climate data and authoritative source for climate information, with some of the flagship products that have been used for decision making and policy making. At that time, NCDC also managed NOAA Climate Data Records Program that archives and serves well-established and trusted climate data product. They are considered as gold standard in the industry. So the question was to NCDC management as well as the CDR management, how can NCDC ensure the quality of its data sets and consistently conveying quality information to users? To help address the first part of the question and address the second part of the question, CDRP has initiated a effort to develop a dataset maturity matrix in late 2012, which I was asked to lead. When the archive and access branch heard our effort and they thought it was a great idea and would like to join force, as the result, we have extended the scope of the maturity metrics to data stewardship maturity metrics. The idea was not to reinvent the wheel, but to leveraging institution knowledge and the community best practices. So in a nutshell, the DSMM is a unified framework for measuring stewardship practices. Those are measurable practices applied to individual data sets. The maturity metrics define the criteria to allow people to assess data set maturity levels in 9 key components. That's within the scope of an open archive information system. For example, it helps to assess how well the data set has been preserved and how well being assessed or used. And along with the practice to assess the data integrity from the time the data set's being transferred to archive to the time that it's being put it out for data access. The maturity metrics was vested through the community engagement. We've done so by thinking domain feedbacks from domain subject matter expert, including data management, science, as well as the technology from internal and external. From the broader community as well by attending ECIP, AMS, and AGU meetings, and also through use case studies. There are 2 parallel efforts were carried out. One by NCEI, focusing on NCEI core data sets. They are with different data types, but managed by the same organizations. Another one by the ECIP Data Stewardship Committee, and focusing on the data set from different disciplines, and managed by different organizations. So since the baseline of the stewardship, it has been applied to over 800 NOVA datasets. It is now a part of NCEI OneStop Ready process, And the utility and implementation of the maturity metrics has been viewed as a positive factor in NCE and NARA audit, also Paleo World Data Center recertification process. And it has been used to define stewardship requirement for new programs and projects, as well as some of the new observation project, data projects. And it has been adapted by international data management and stewardship entities. So initially, the stewardship maturity metrics of data set were evaluated manually. It is very labor intensive and is not scalable. So many tools and workflows are developed by OneStop project to improve its scalability, as well as to streamline the evaluation and integration process. One of the such is a web form-based data stewardship maturity questionnaire with a pre-populated question and answers. It not only streamlined the evaluation process, but also produced more consistent assessment. Amanda and Paul have put together a very nice poster. And if you're interested to learn more or talk to them about it, please stop by their poster tomorrow. And future training sessions are planned in ISIP and NOAA EDM meetings as well. There are additional tools and workflows. Those are relevant to this session, are those for automatic, systematic, generate the machine readable and interoperable ISO dataset level quality metadata as a part of the collection level metadata. And that's being integrated into the OneStop system. And another one is to generate sort of automatically generate a draft of human readable and citable data stewardship maturity report. We're in the process of publishing those reports by NOAA Central Library with DOI minted and assigned that can be in reference back to the its collection level metadata. So a collective DSMM scores for the OneStop ready data sets are displayed at the OneStop portal. Their individual levels and the fact it was assessed, it's being used in the search and discover algorithm. Additional details can be found as our practical application paper, which is published last year by Data Science Journal. One. Yeah. Okay. So wrong order. The takeaway message is that maturity assessment models can be used to measure and represent quality ratings on a data set level. In here, I have presented an example of data stewardship maturity metrics, and there are also maturity metrics for science quality and service quality, for example. And I've been championing that it is a high time for community to come together for a standardized approach, which would help improve the usability and interoperability of dataset quality ratings. I do want to indicate that the development and application of the maturity metrics will not be possible without contribution and support from many people and organizations. I won't have time to go through the list, but I do want to include here and to emphasize that fact. And I appreciate all their effort and contribution. And one another thing I would like to mention is that ISIP Information Quality Cluster and other national international organizations are planning for a workshop or sessions for the ECIP 2020 summer meetings to develop a community guideline for consistently curating dataset quality information. And if you're interested in that effort and also in interesting application of data stewardship maturity metrics, please contact us. And I also list a link to some additional DSM resources. And thank you very much for listening. And I'll stop here for questions if you have any.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have questions for Ping? Ruth, if
That's good. I made it myself very clear. Push it the time.
Well, Ruth is uploading her slides. I did have one question. You mentioned that you're using the scores for search and discovery. How does that affect the ranking of how datasets are appearing in search?
That's a very good question. Initially, we had a very ambitious plan to go into individual key components because some of the components touch on, for example, what formats, et cetera, et cetera. However, I think in the end, the decision was to use this as a tiebreaker. So if everything else being equal and the data stewardship maturity, the stewardship quality is assessed, will make it a little bit higher ranking. However, in theory, the criteria as well as the level of maturity in individual key components can be used to assess how well they're being, findable or accessible or interoperable, even usable or reusable. Hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Okay, let me give you back. How do I give back your?
I'll take it back. Don't worry.
Okay.
Thank you, Ping.
You're welcome.
Is it this one? Noting. If you could just pull it over onto the desktop, because otherwise you won't have some sound.
Okay, I think we're good now.
Okay. That's a new problem. We're just gonna do that.
Hi, my name is Amrita Alamparthi. I work for US Global Change Research Program as data manager. I work for a system called Global Change Information System. I'm going to talk about evaluating our provenance, assessing our metadata. If you have not seen Global Change Information System, this is our front page. We manage metadata for primary publications of US Global Change Research Program. These are all the resources of Global Change Information Systems. We start from report, the primary report, and then we break down report into chapters and the references, citations, and we add metadata for all the resources available in GCIS. And that's our website, data.globalchange.gov. And these are our featured publications, basically our primary publications. If you've heard about National Climate Assessment, it's volume 1 and 2, and also Human Health, which was published in 2016. Climate Science Special Report was published in 2017, and the 4th National Climate Assessment, volume 2, was released in 2018. This is how it looks like, the front page of NCA4 in GCIS. And the objectives of our evaluator are just to first to evaluate our provenance for the primary publication, and then to inform decision on where to direct the data management work, like basically to find gaps in our metadata by assessing ourselves. These are the 3 basic logics of the score assessment. We try to complete the resource metadata for a given resource, what is required to be acceptable or complete. If it's bad, how bad we are, and what needs to be filled in the metadata. And the second thing is to connect these resources, and for a given resource, what is required to be connected, and then for a given resource, what are the components underneath a resource. So for example, internal score chapter is a resource underneath the report, and we will check if the chapter has all the database field filled. And connection score checks if a chapter has its contributors, basically the authors or chapter lead, or any kind of contributor with its affiliations. And it also checks the references of a chapter, the citations. And component score checks what's underneath the chapter, basically key findings or a table or a figure underneath the chapter. Here's the basic design. We have scoring system from 1 to 5, very poor, poor, acceptable, good, and very good. If it's very poor, it does not contain enough info, and that's where we need to focus on to say the data is just an orphan data. We need to either connect or remove the data. And poor, it has some sort of data, but we need to establish more provenance and do more research on that. Acceptable is okay. Good and very good are, very good is basically making sure if you have more linked open data available so we can establish more provenance. And this is how the script works. It checks if the metadata is acceptable. If it's acceptable, it checks if it's good. If it's good, it checks if it's very good. And if it's not acceptable, it checks if it's poor or very poor. This is an example of how chapter metadata internal score works. So ID and report ID are mandatory fields. Once that's completed, it checks for either DOI or URL or any persistent identifier that takes you to the actual page of the chapter or any resource for that matter. And if the ID or DOI URL is available, it checks for a title. And title is, if there's no title, it's still acceptable since it has a hyperlink from the original page. And it checks for a number. If all the metadata fields are populated, it's very good. If it's only DOI or URL, it's acceptable. But if it's just the mandatory fields populated, it is still acceptable, but poor. And if there's not even a title, it's very poor. So we need to focus more of poor and very poor metadata. Here is an example to show how chapter 1 looks like. We ran the script against chapter 1. The score is a 5 for chapter 1 because all the fields are populated, like the report identifier, chapter number, DOI, URL, and sort key are populated. And the script also has the depth in it. Basically, the default depth is 0, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, any level of depth. Depth 1 runs for like 10, 20 minutes. If you run depth 2, it runs overnight. So we didn't go to that level, but this is depth 1. So it runs against metadata for contributors of a chapter and components like figures, tables, and key messages, and also references of a chapter. And references has their own child publications, such as report, article, or any kind of citation, which we track. And for the reference child publications, we also populate the contributors like authors and affiliations of the report or article. So if it looks more green, that means we're doing a good job at our work. And I could show a demo. It's not on our production site yet. Okay. Sorry about it. No, I can't do anything.
You can't do anything at all?
It just takes to a browser. Oh. Thanks. But I think I'm probably going to skip this. It's taking a lot of time.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about what each of the circumferences of this very cool diagram.
Well, I was going to zoom into these orange and red levels of this and see how we are lacking and to see how incomplete the metadata is. Basically, we have one author that's red because the only things we have is the first name and last name. To be a good author, he has to have his URL, OrcID, and his affiliation when he published an article. If it's not there, it shows very poor in our system. So that's what basically I was going to show. But this is and for the future, we are trying to show these scores dynamically for every single objects we have. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and we are also planning to show this when during the data collection period. If an author is entering the data, if it gives them the score when they enter the data, it might encourage them to add more metadata, like how important OrcID is to add when you're entering data into a system. And we are also planning to integrate fair metadata in it to see how fair our individual objects in GCIS are. Yeah, thank you. I can't move the slides.
So your slides are frozen too?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm so sorry.
We have 2 more slides.
You're asking more like what the diagram itself. Yeah. Each circumference is a level down, like as you go out. So the inner ring is the finishing ring. The second ring is the finishing ring. Yeah, I think I sort of understand it, but use up a little bit of time to wait for the technology.
No, I have the presentation.
That's why it's corrupted. Okay. I gotta break it again. Go me. This is the broken one. That was my fault. I clicked on it.
Oh, yeah. That one.
Thanks, Robin.
No, unfortunately. That is for
You can force it.
Interesting.
Yes. The old part comes through.
Yeah, purely PC.
We can test it on
Of course, Queen. God, it's so much easier than that.
Die. Okay, now that's going. Well, you guys got the audio thing fixed, right?
I think so.
Let's try this again. Is this it?
Yeah, that.
That's the one below.
Well,
Oh, this is
that's,
Jesus.
that's corrupted. So.
So do you have to? So put it back in.
We may not have much of a discussion at the end of this session, other than thanks for sticking with it.
This guy?
And then just drag it to the desktop instead of opening it.
Okay.
But yeah, just drag it over. And then open it.
So I think
Close that
I'll
one.
close this one.
And then open that one. And then adjust this.
Hang on. Okay. And then this. And then,
Yeah, and then make it open.
and you can see your slides here instead of, or do you like that preview thing?
No, this is fine. Thank you. Yeah, and then I think that this is all.
More guarantees.
Yeah, that's fine. Good. Thank you.
This is just a comparison of different chapters of how the metadata is assessed. And the orange parts of chapter 111, 19, 20 are references of a report, EPA report, and that doesn't have a file because we couldn't find the file. So that's why it's orange, and it's referenced for all 4 chapters. And here are the future enhancements we are trying to, like I said, we're going to version this course, and as we update the conventions, as we update the standards, we version this course and document the versions as well. And also generate scores for the connections and components of resources separately, and have dynamic scores and visualization as well on the front page. Integrate fair metadata evaluator and generate scores during data collection, so it makes it more easier. That's my team. My team leads here, our new developer, Zach, and we have a new intern as well. Questions?
Thanks, Amber. Did I hear that right, that those were EPA reports?
Yeah.
EPA where you couldn't find the files online? Yeah. Interesting.
Well, we could download it, but they don't have it available for other sites to have it. I don't know how exactly that works. We have the link to where you can download, but we cannot add the download file to our page. And that's why it shows the file is not available. Yeah.
What are the different, like the inner circle and the outer circle?
It's basically levels underneath. So the first page, like if you go into a web page's first page and shows how the chapters and what's underneath a chapter could have tables, and the table could have more references. So each levels of data, and usually the final level of data will be author and their affiliation, and authors can have OrcID and their biography page. And for affiliation, they could have organization URL. We are also planning to integrate ROR IDs to our organization. That could be another additional metadata field.
Yeah, I think this is really, this has been great stuff ever since it started, the whole provenance stuff that you guys are doing. And but do the scores sort of flow from the outside of the diagram into the center somehow? So, I mean, can we go back and, so yeah, so where there's orange, is it the orange on the lower right of this that makes the green at the next level in a little bit lighter? It would seem to me that if you had orange, I mean, is there a relationship between the scores at each level, sort of? I mean, are they aggregated up as you go to the center?
Yes, they're related from the center, and there is a border, and the space where it shows the provenance of reference at one reference, and it has other related links to it, or the sub-levels.
But you're asking whether the score is the one affects the score of the other. Yeah, like if when we were talking about it earlier today, you have to keep a person, and you need an email and the affiliation and the name. If you didn't have one of those, then the score for the person would reflect the lack of something. So they would sort of, it would seem to me they would, the scores would sort of aggregate towards the center, but I couldn't be wrong about that. So what these are showing just each one's sort of independent within that resource, where we also have like a separate score of how good is the stuff supporting it. So in that case, it would flow from the outside.
Okay, and then like in the upper right-hand corner, right below contributors, where the size of the things, the radial dimension of the things on the outside rings are the same as you go in. Is that just a hierarchy which is just has one element at each level, sort of? And then the ones where there's thinner on the outside, there's multiple elements at that level. Right. Yeah. This is called a sunburst, isn't it?
Yeah, it's D3 sunburst.
I think, trying to figure out ways to look at these large collections of things and sort of grok what the big scale patterns is. It's really something that's challenging when you start going out these bigger collections. So I think this is really interesting. I've tried some of these for a while, and I haven't gotten back to them. But I really like the diagram, the visualization. Let's take a while to get used to it.
I'm not familiar with how the data is managed to be stored, but are you following links to URLs to sites elsewhere on the internet? In this analysis, are you crawling those links, or are these all just citations within the document?
This is every single link that takes you. The final level would be a person link. But if you're asking about external links, we also we also hold external links, but we check if the links work. Whatever links we're using is working.
Is the underlying data still in a triple score?
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thanks, Tamara, for being so patient with all the technical difficulties. So next we're going to move on to Sarah from NOAA, and her presentation is called Quality Metadata in the National Climate Assessment. That one.
Yes. I had a link to go to the browser, so I'm hoping it can work. Mine is just, it's the public assessment page, so that should be Fingers
crossed.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I actually appreciate the little bit of out of orderness because I think Amrita's presentation was a really nice introduction to what I'm going to talk about here today. It's also going to be a little bit of a different shift. I think one of the questions for this session was, do you provide a metric, probably in terms of something quantifiable? And the answer for us is technically no. But utilizing what the Global Change Information System is providing in their provenance evaluator, we could say kind of yes. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is how we demonstrate quality of the metadata that we are providing with the National Climate Assessment. As I was introduced, my name is Sarah Champion. I'm with the Technical Support Unit for the National Climate Assessment. It is NOAA's Technical Support Unit. I am a Cooperative Institute employee, and to save you the confusing nature of all of the acronyms, I'm just going to say I also work with Peng, and she already introduced us. So next. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the assessment. I'm not sure how familiar the audience here is with the assessment itself and why we actually do it. And then I'm going to go into this set of 4 things that frame how we are demonstrating the quality of the underlying metadata that we're collecting for each of the things that Amrita kind of highlighted there that are going into the GCIS system. So the National Climate Assessment is mandated by the Global Change Research Act of 1990. What that says is that every 4 years, we're going to provide this national report that is a state of the science assessment of climate impacts and trends for the United States regions and sectors. The purpose is to inform decision and policymakers, excuse me. And it's part of what's called a sustained assessment process. And what that means is, in addition to every 4 years where we're producing this national assessment, in those interim periods, we're also creating other government reports in climate change topics that are going to contribute to the next national climate assessment. Amrita mentioned one of those, and that was the climate change on health. I'm messing that title up. We always call it the health report. Climate change impacts on human health, I believe is what it's called. So the sustained assessment was enacted alongside the production of the 3rd National Climate Assessment, which was released in 2014. As you can see before that, we weren't very good at meeting the 4-year objective. The first 2 were about 9 years apart from their intended deadline there. Again, the Human Health Impacts Report was produced in 2016. We also have produced a set of state climate summaries. Those are in the process of being updated now. And then we also have volumes 1 and volumes 2 of the 4th National Climate Assessment. And all of those, the Human Health Report and the climate summaries are part of that sustained assessment suite of reports that are going into the next. Part of this is to illustrate what that sustained assessment looks like, but the other is to kind of illustrate the quantity or magnitude of information that we are producing with these reports. So there's quite a lot of information being presented and released to the public. So how do we measure quality of these reports? This is where things take a little bit of a change in my mind from the previous presentations. I'm going to graciously leverage what Ted introduced in the last session, where quality is maybe not so much a series of numbers and checkpoints, but evaluating how useful it is, what value is it providing to the end user. So is it understandable, is it accessible, and are people doing things with it? And that's pretty much how we are evaluating the quality of our metadata. The other thing is that we are beholden to a series of government mandates. So in a sense, it kind of makes it easy because we have to. And we do that by a series of in-house developed user tools. They are intended for an average citizen to be able to access, navigate, and interact with, so that we can demonstrate value to the average citizen as well as policymakers. So these government mandates presented here, this is a kind of a linear presentation. As we all understand, they're not exactly linear, but they are related. I put this together just in the last year. I should have done it a long time ago, because today is actually really refreshing for me to be talking to a group of folks that I don't have to convince that metadata is important. I generally talk with folks who do need to be convinced, and that kind of touches on the other concept of using terminology like mandatory. Funny story, I've had folks come up to me and literally say, so if I publish first, I don't have to complete as much metadata. I'm like, no, that's not the attitude that we want to take here. Technically, yes, but let's not make that the goal. So anyway, this all began with President's Climate Action Plan, which is summarized to say that we are going to do something about climate change. That led to the Climate Data Initiative that says we're going to use federal climate data in that pursuit. The Information Quality Act says that we are going to provide quality data by measuring in elements of transparency and accessibility of those data. These reports are also labeled as highly influential scientific assessments, and that means that they also have to demonstrate reproducibility of the findings. And that's where we tend to be a little bit different. We go beyond the concept of data set metadata. We are providing metadata for the entire report. And Amrutha kind of gave a visual of what that looks like when we talk about authors and affiliations, not just associated with the underlying data, but who are generating the science that are within these reports through the figures and so on. And then we have our new friend, the Evidence Act, more specifically Title II, which is the open data title of that act. And that says that not only do we have to demonstrate transparency and accessibility, the data need to be distributed under an open license, they need to be machine readable, and they need to be tracked. And this is also extended to not just the data, but also the underlying information. So the good news for us is that we're already largely doing a lot of that. The new additions for us or challenges is with regards to software code, which has implications on intellectual property rights and how to apply licenses in those use cases. And I'll get into a little bit of that further on. But I wanted to give an introduction to the government mandates that we are beholden to that are requiring the metadata that we're creating with these assessments. The other slice of the quality pie I mentioned was that we built some in-house user-friendly tools, and I'm going to demonstrate that by using an example figure from the last National Climate Assessment. This is figure 1.2. We refer to it as our indicators figure. It is the second most popular figure in the entire report, and it is the first most popular figure in terms of access metadata, underlying metadata. And this figure is a good example because it is a numbered figure in the report, but each one of those individual charts constitute an individual figure panel in our system and terminology. Each one of those figure panels, we document underlying metadata, and that metadata includes the panel source, which could be from a published entity, or it could be something that was originally created for this report, which is an important distinction. We also collect the source of any data that were analyzed and visualized. We collect information on how those data were analyzed and visualized, the methodology behind that, and also which tools, hardware and software were used to perform that analysis. And that is documented for each one of these panels, which, as you can see here, there are 13 individual panels. That's quite a bit of documentation. So to accomplish that, we created an in-house web-based author survey as part of our author collaboration system. It is affectionately referred to as the GDAS system. We're hoping to update that name to mean something that means something to anybody, really, in future versions. In that survey, we collect everything. It is input by the authors and contributors associated with the science being visualized in each of those, the figure and the figure panels, as you can see here. It's blurry, but I'm hoping to show you a much better version, assuming I can navigate out to a browser and a few slides from now. But the first things that we collect are basic information. We have them assign keywords, which are generated from the GCMD keyword list. We also have them designate, where did you get this figure panel? Are you, what's the word I'm looking for, excuse me. Are you using it from a published source, or are you creating it specifically for this report? And that's an important indicator in our process, because if it's original, then we require that additional documentation. If it's not, it generates a process for us to evaluate copyright permission what level of permission do we need to acquire in order to reuse? That's what I was looking for, reuse in our report. This particular panel example, it is original, and so we asked them to identify which people are associated with its production in terms of contributors. We can see there we do collect name, organization, affiliation, and an email address. We've had some really interesting conversations recently about including work IDs there as well. And then also, did you analyze data? If so, what is the name of the data set and what is the URL from which we can find that? If this has been a data set that has been previously cited in another assessment report or in another report that's included in the GCIS, that is where that information is pulled from in an effort to try and maintain consistency between records. So if it's an original, this is where we collect additional metadata documentation to include how did you analyze the data, how did you visualize the data, and we ask them to simply provide us a step-by-step recipe. It has gotten much better over the course of the assessment evolution between the third and the fourth, and it is QC'd by me. I am the human in the loop. So it's quite an endeavor. But then after the analysis and visualization methods, we ask for whether or not these methods are published and what information goes along with whether they are or are not. And then we ask them to identify which software and hardware tools that they used and some other fields that are identified as part of the ISO documentation standard for completing these kinds of records. It's kind of a challenge because we're trying to take something that is traditionally focused around data sets and apply it to something that is much more broad with the assessment metadata. And this is all in an effort to say, well, we have a platform and a tool and a standard that we can rely on, but we also are using it as a mechanism for us to demonstrate that accessibility and transparency, and I wouldn't say more importantly, but probably more visibly, the reproducibility of the findings within these reports. So from there, we take the information that's collected in these web-based surveys and we sync them into the GCIS system. And from there, GCIS uses it to do the things that Amrutha just talked about, but we use it as a kind of a place to push things and put it for future use. So goes into GCIS, it is managed and curated and checked against the GCIS methodologies, and then we take it back out and we put it into what is known as our interactive metadata viewer. And this viewer is accompanies every numbered figure in the report, and it is part of the final suite of assessment information products that are released to the public. And if I'm able to do it successfully, I'm going to try and show you what that looks like in real time. Ooh. Success. So this is the 4th National Climate Assessment website, specifically Chapter 1. And if we scroll down, you'll see, not that this is the figure we're talking about, but you can see there's a eyeball icon, and that is there for every figure. We'll scroll down to the figure that we're talking about here. And when you click on it, it will launch our interactive metadata viewer. And what this viewer is the average citizen's way of experiencing all of the collected metadata for that figure down to the panel level. So the first tab here, it includes the caption, which is extremely long for this particular figure. And it basically introduces it. This is a 13-panel figure, and each panel was created on this date, and whether it did or did not include any data analysis. This is kind of a way to say, you may want to continue looking through the viewer, or maybe you can be satisfied and stop here. This is where all of the fun stuff exists. I'm trying to scroll here. It is not scrolling, which is not, okay, that's user error. So each one of these panels is expandable and collapsible to give a kind of a independent user experience so that you don't have to digest all of this information at once. So as you saw, that figure is very complex. So if you're interested in understanding each panel, you can do it one at a time. Let's see if I can't get it. It doesn't look like it's allowing me to scroll here. It's not. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So this is the more specific metadata collected for each of the panels. It highlights what those analysis and visualization methods and tools were used to produce this figure panel. And then it also gives you information about the data that were analyzed and visualized, and you can navigate through each of those. And that's meant to be very interactive and tailored to the user's interest level. Moving quickly forward, we provide a plain text view of all of the collected metadata as a full record in this panel. And then we also offer this opportunity to download individual elements. And this is in the spirit of promoting further use beyond the report itself. So folks can download the individual image files for each of the panels, as well as the full metadata record here down at the bottom. If I can figure out, there we go, I think. Trying to open my PowerPoint back up. Oh, it just said removed. I clicked on it and it went away. I'm sorry. Nope. Click on the next one. PowerPoint? Ah, there we go. Okay. Okay, so this is okay. So how do we get to measuring quality? And what I was just saying is that the utility in that interactive viewer is meant to encourage further use of that information. And so kind of leveraging off of what Ted was saying before is, can people get to this? Is it understandable? And can they do what they need to do with it? This is a quote that I really like to use in these presentations, and I think it really sums up why we are encouraging the value behind this metadata. Is we can have all the data we want, but if we don't know what to do with it, what it's about, how to understand it, how to use it, it really doesn't generate anything for us. And in order to get the information we need to understand that data. So here's a couple of examples of some actionable output from the metadata from the 4th National Climate Assessment. The first example here is from NPR. They contacted us after exploring the metadata record. And that's a sign of progress for us, because before that, with the 3rd assessment, folks were contacting us just to find where the metadata might be accessed and how to better understand it. So folks are learning that we're providing this information, and they're interested in doing something with it. And they're starting at the point of after experiencing the record itself. So NPR here asked us, how can we take what you did and put it into a tailored product so that we can demonstrate the connection between precipitation in our area and climate change in a visual product? Another example is linking the content in the assessment and tying it to policy relevant decisions. So again, generating the mechanism for conversation, understanding, and actionable output. The Huffington Post highlighted that the administration is focused on things like unsafe drinking water and extreme wildfire, and specifically highlighted that, oh yeah, 4th National Climate Assessment is talking about this. And here's an opportunity for us to say, and if you'd like to understand what you can do with that information for these kinds of conversations, please go access our metadata. Metadata viewer provides everything you might need. So as I was hinting at, this is an evolutionary process. We've gotten much better with each subsequent assessment and interim product. Each assessment is meant to build upon its previous. And so as you can see, we're kind of stacking a nice little set of Legos. We're hoping eventually to make a little bit more progress on this pyramid. But I think this is really representative to those individual blocks. I mean, there's a lot of information that we're dealing with here. So then how does the Evidence Act come into play? How are we including this in our suite of metadata information? And I will say it's quite a challenge. And I hinted at that in the beginning with regards to intellectual property rights and licensing. Just for an example, the first 2 volumes, or the only 2 volumes of the 4th National Climate Assessment, there were nearly 2,000 pages, nearly 1,000 figure panels that included over 150 data sets. And those reports were created by a team of more than 350 authors. What's important for the Evidence Act conversation is from where those authors are coming from. What are the affiliations? And just so you can understand that, for the volume 2, we had 15 federal departments, 5 national labs, 20 research institutions and nonprofits, 3 government contract companies, 28 local government organizations, and 65 different universities. And some of those were even international. So in theory, each one of those could potentially have their own intellectual property process, office, all of those things. Give me a time warning. Okay, I'm almost done. It's really hard. I'm done now. So for us, it's been a way to kind of anticipate and manage what we're calling an administrative burden for potentially having to accommodate all these different kinds of authored use cases. And also what it means then, okay, so we've identified the mechanism, but then also what if they say, well, yes, we do own the intellectual property for this, and no, you can't use it. So there's always that potential too. So what we did was we broke down our assessment information into two categories, and this is kind of simplistic, but it's getting the conversation moving. We either have resources contributed from federal assets, or an open domain, or non-federal and non-open domain. And if we, regardless of whether those two categories we're working with, we're going to still document all of our source metadata just as we had before. That's not going to change. If we are working with a federal resource, we're hoping to be able to quickly and clearly identify whatever associated licenses are defined by these agencies. If they are non-federal, we are actually going to claim exemption from the Evidence Act. Instead of going out and pursuing every possible use case, we'll never get the report out. So to do that, we're actually working in partnership with the Department of Commerce and NOAA Chief Data Officer on these agency guidelines as they're working in these teams to help define them. We're also working with NOAA Legal to have them create the legally binding forms and documentation that we can have our authors complete, that basically assign, identify affiliation and assign any level of distribution rights. And then the repository is probably going to be some neat combination between us and the GCIS. And as you may or may not know, the 5th National Climate Assessment, we are starting to ramp those activities up, and we are working expeditiously to try and stay ahead of this as much as possible, as we are anticipating having to start working with authors probably around the summer of this year. So we'd like to have at least the guidance mechanisms in place by the spring of 2020. And that is it. This is my favorite thing to include in presentations because it's hardcore. And this is a partnership, as I mentioned in the beginning. So thank you all for allowing me to speak today. I'll take any questions. Do you want me to escape out of here? Okay. Oh, I don't know. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting.
My pleasure.
Last but not least, we have John, who is here to talk about challenges with identifying and assessing authoritative data. Yeah.
Cool. We're good?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Hi, I'm John Davidson. I'm with Image Matters. I'm the task manager for the technical support team for geoplatform.gov. I don't know, raise your hand if you're familiar with geoplatform.gov. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, well, a lot of it about that, and some of the challenges we have in our mission with aggregating and curating. Oops, page down. What's the best way to page down? I was looking for a page down button because I'm a Windows user.
Yeah, it's the side keys.
The side keys, of course. Okay, so GeoPlatform is its mission is to aggregate and curate federal authoritative data sets that are produced by multiple agencies across the federal space, and also including our partners at different levels of government, state, local, tribal, NGOs, and academia. The challenge we have is finding what authoritative data sets that are relevant and the services associated with those data is just way too hard. It's hard, and Google doesn't help. And agencies, every agency has their own catalog and portals into their data, into their world. But our job is to span across those portals and catalogs and to aggregate those data and make them more accessible through the Geo platform. Problem with each agency's, some are very good, NASA and NOAA, for example, but they're disconnected and inconsistent from one agency to the next. So our challenge is to, now we have to fit it to the page. Can we still fit?
You're trying to go back.
No, I'm just trying to get the whole thing onto the page. Sorry for being a dummy. Can't we just get the whole, there we go. Maybe that's it.
I think, oh, yeah.
Okay, okay.
There you go.
Are we good? Okay. So challenge is there's just not enough quality metadata out there in the world, and it's incomplete, and it's not machine readable. It's not machine understandable, too. We'll talk more about that. Just a sneak preview. The key is using controlled vocabularies like GCMD, for example, to ground the keywords and the themes and the places as concepts, as semantic concepts in the metadata. To consistently identify the responsible agencies, especially those that are responsible for publishing the data set or the service. That's a problem. Of course, using descriptive titles and complete abstracts that explain why the data set exists is really helpful. And finally, to unambiguously link data sets with related resources, services, for example, and the layers served up by those services, and the linkages from those layers back, for example, to the data sets. Those are the keys in our experience with aggregating data from disparate sources. So search is a challenge. Google, all of these, we're using the same query to search for the National Levy Database, an authoritative federal data set. They all produce, nowadays, pretty decent results. But which one do we use? Which one is the authoritative source for authoritative data that we're looking for? Another is for services on data sets. There's just the quality of the metadata on the service, that's the capabilities document on the service URL endpoint, is missing, or the URL is not even resolvable in the metadata. There's no title, no description, many of them, there's no publisher identified on the service level metadata. The qualitative rankings are really from this one sample that we had working with a given community. 87% were just sort of crappy metadata on the service. Okay, so it's a problem, not just for this one community, but within the National Spatial Data Infrastructure, which is what the Geo platform is sort of the keystone for the NSDI. We're just trying to get to even different communities, different actors. Even for a given data set, there's producers, there's the analysts synthesizing new products, there's the decision makers, the operators on the ground, and they all have a common purpose, but they have different roles and do different things in production, in the life cycle of production and maintenance of given data set, and they speak sort of different vocabularies, right? And they have different interests and levels of separation of concerns, really. So we have to deal with how we can make the data discoverable, but also how we can make it discoverable and how we can enhance the metadata to do that but also how we can have users sort of using a different language, the first responder, for example, trying to use a scientific, science data set, uses a different language to do that. And so what we have to do is mediate those vocabularies. So we're interested in what is authoritative federal data. And it begins with, do you trust the data and why? Can we answer those questions? I don't know. What does it even mean to be authoritative data? Especially in the context of federal geospatial data. Why is it important? And there's just sort of fundamental questions we're asking ourselves and trying to get our heads around the problem. Is it a problem? Is it a solved problem? Or are there areas where we can improve the discovery of authoritative data? So some definitions just from various different communities. The key here is authorized legal authority, using sort of common terms, specific business purposes, processes for validation, verification, and certification, recognized official sources with a mission or a mission to produce reliable and accurate data, for use by customers, more than one customer, hopefully. So these are the keys here about what is an authoritative data set. Within the federal geospatial community, and within the Federal Geodata Committee, FGDC, and through this OMBA 16, we're mandated to, agencies are mandated to produce what are called the National Geospatial Data Assets, right? And there's approximately 176 of those within 17 themes, Anyway, so the NGDA is a source of authoritative federal data, and you can find information about those here at these links here, about the resources themselves, the data sets, and the related resources, and as well as the process for governing those data sets here at this other link. So that's one sort of level of branding for authoritative federal data. Then there's the GDA 2018 Geospatial Data Act, which is part of the other family of legislation, including the Evidence Act and the Open Data Act and the federal other legislation and strategy documents. So within the GDA, it identifies the need for adopting and using international standards. It clearly now formally defines the role of the geoplatform, geoplatform.gov, which is to include metadata about all federal data, open geospatial data, and to provide means to access the data. And then the covered agencies, those responsible for producing and publishing those data, have responsibilities to publish maps and diagrams and metadata about those data sets, and to collaborate and coordinate with the geoplatform, and to establish common published practices and procedures for publishing. So that's the GDA. Bottom line for geoplatform is we need a reliable, machine-ready way to access the data, wherever it is. It's not on the geoplatform. It's in your agency portal.
somewhere. But we need to be able to access it if it's open data. And we need to be able to access it hopefully in more than one way, like direct download or through web services or other applications and APIs. And then if it's derived data from those authoritative sources, we need to understand why that was created, that derived data set, and especially, so that we can identify fitness for use. Okay, so those of us in the geospatial data management and production business familiar with these sort of dimensions of how we think about metadata and especially about, I think about what does trust mean, and it means we know the provenance of the data, where it came from, and what happened to it to get to my desk. We understand some level of semantics, again, through controlled vocabularies, to mediate across domains from the scientist to the farmer to the emergency management professional. We understand the data quality to sufficient degree in terms of correctness, completeness, accuracy. We know, or we have, we know it's open, and it's, is it open? And we can determine if it's open and reliably accessible. And for example, is the metadata in sync with the data? For example, we need to know that. Is it really descriptive of the data that we're interested in? Policies and governance. How frequently is it changing? How do I know when it changes? How can I provide feedback to the producers about the metadata itself or the data set itself? So we need mechanisms for feedback upstream from the consumer, upstream to the producer. And is it an appropriate kind of data for my needs? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we've thought in thinking about the legislation and about the problems that I've just outlined, we have a sort of a set of criteria that we're using to describe trust and and describe data as evidence, and it requires open data, 5-star linked open data that's machine understandable, it's available and secured and assured, the provenance is known, there's ways to know the provenance and determine the provenance and the quality of service. And there's governance mechanisms for managing the life cycle of the data. So how do we implement it in software? Because that's the business I'm in, implementing software. How do we expose that information to end users? I've come across a number of mechanisms like the data operational readiness level rubric that's come out of ESIP here. And anyway, our objectives are some cross-domain way, standard way for scoring metadata, exposing that to users in real simple ways, but that is machine, it doesn't require a human to read the metadata. It requires a machine to be able to interpret it and use the metadata to expose that information to the user. And the whole idea is to promote those authoritative data sets, those that score higher in the trust rubric over other data for improved decision making. Standards are needed, a couple different ideas on how one could do that on the right. And of course, governance is an essential element. And tools to enable governance. just some references to sources and other stakeholders in this work. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, John. So we're over on time, but I'm sure that any of the speakers will be willing to hang around if you have questions or you want to discuss any of this further. Thank you to everyone who attended. We really appreciate it.
And then you'll just upload them to Figshare.
Yeah. Thank you for all your help.
I'm not sure why there's like somehow GoToMeeting is also frozen.
Thanks to everybody online for attending. We really appreciate it.
This conference will now be recorded.
Officially.